My mother-in-law called me worthless at dinner in front of the entire family. I smiled, pulled out my phone, and showed everyone what I had been recording for months. When they saw what was on that screen, the room went dead silent, and I never saw my husband's family the same way again. The plan was supposed to be simple. Sunday dinner at the Whitmores' house in Ridgemont. You know the drill. Arrive at 5, endure small talk about the weather, pretend to enjoy Diana's overcooked roast beef, and make it home by 8 with our marriage intact and my sanity barely hanging on. I'm Avery, by the way, 32 years old, marketing manager at a tech startup called InnovateTech, and apparently the family disappointment, according to my mother-in-law, Diana Whitmore. My husband Trevor and I had been married for 3 years, and these monthly dinners had become a tradition I'd grown to dread with every fiber of my being. Let me paint you a picture of what these dinners were really like, because on the surface, they looked like something out of a Norman Rockwell painting. The Whitmores lived in this massive colonial house on Elm Ridge Drive, the kind of neighborhood where every lawn looked like it belonged in a magazine, and every driveway had at least one luxury car parked in it. Their house was particularly impressive. Red brick with white columns, wraparound porch with hanging baskets that somehow stayed perfectly watered and bloomed year-round, and a front yard that could have hosted a small wedding reception. But here's the thing about perfect-looking houses. Sometimes the people inside them are anything but perfect. Diana Whitmore was 67 years old, retired from her career as a high school principal, and had apparently decided that her new full-time job was making my life miserable. She was one of those women who had perfected the art of passive-aggressive commentary disguised as concern. You know the type. They could deliver the most devastating insult with a smile and a tone so sweet it would give you diabetes. She had this way of looking at me, like I was a stain on her perfectly coordinated throw pillows. Not an obvious stare, mind you. Diana was far too sophisticated for that. It was more like peripheral surveillance, where I could feel her cataloging every choice I made, every word I spoke, every breath I took, filing it all away in some mental database labeled "Reasons Why Avery Isn't Good Enough for My Son." Trevor, my husband, was 34 and worked as an architect for a prestigious firm downtown. He was tall, had these warm brown eyes that had initially drawn me in, and possessed the kind of easy charm that made strangers trust him immediately. When we first met at a coffee shop near my office 4 years ago, he seemed like the perfect guy. Funny, successful, family-oriented. The family-oriented part, as it turned out, came with some significant strings attached. His father, William, was actually decent, quiet, worked in finance, spent most family gatherings nodding politely and trying to avoid getting caught in the crossfire between his wife and whoever her current target happened to be, which, for the past 3 years, had been me. The thing is, I wasn't always Diana's target. When Trevor first brought me home to meet his parents, she was all smiles and warmth. She asked about my job, my family, my hobbies. She even complimented my earrings and asked where I'd gotten them. I remember thinking, wow, I really lucked out with the in-law situation. That lasted exactly until Trevor and I got engaged. The shift was so subtle at first that I thought I was imagining it. Comments that seemed supportive but had this tiny edge to them. "Oh, Avery, you're so career-focused. I'm sure you'll figure out how to balance everything once you have children." Or, "That's an interesting choice for a wedding venue. Very modern." The word modern delivered like she was saying infectious disease. By the time Trevor and I actually got married, Diana had perfected her technique. She could make me feel about 2 inches tall while simultaneously appearing to be the most supportive mother-in-law in the world. It was like being slowly poisoned by someone who kept asking if you needed more water. The monthly dinner started about 6 months after our wedding. Diana's idea, naturally. "Family is so important," she'd say. "We need to make sure we stay connected." What she really meant was, "I need regular opportunities to monitor and critique your existence." These weren't casual, come-as-you-are affairs either. Diana treated every dinner like a formal dinner party. The dining room table was always set with her good china, the kind with tiny blue flowers that probably cost more than my monthly rent, cloth napkins that had to be ironed into perfect rectangles, Multiple courses served on plates that you were terrified to touch because they looked like they belonged in a museum. She always cooked the same meal: pot roast, mashed potatoes, green beans that had been cooked until they surrendered all hope of maintaining any texture, and dinner rolls that could have been used as hockey pucks. Trevor loved it because it reminded him of his childhood. I endured it because refusing to eat Diana's cooking would have been tantamount to declaring war. The conversations followed a predictable pattern, too. Diana would ask about my work in a tone that suggested she was asking about a particularly nasty rash. She'd update us on the various charity committees she served on, making sure to mention how busy and important she was. She'd talk about Trevor's childhood accomplishments like he'd just won a Nobel Prize last week, and she'd find small, seemingly innocent ways to remind me that I wasn't quite measuring up to her standards.
Oh, Avery, you're looking a little tired lately. Are you getting enough sleep? Proper rest is so important for maintaining your appearance. I saw Janet Morrison at the grocery store yesterday. You remember Janet, don't you? Her daughter-in-law just had the most beautiful baby. They're so happy. Trevor, you've been working so hard lately. I hope Avery is taking good care of you at home. The crazy thing was, she was so good at it that calling her out would have made me look like the problem. If I'd said, "Diana, you're being passive-aggressive," she would have looked genuinely hurt and confused. "Oh my goodness, Avery, I was just trying to be helpful. I had no idea you were so sensitive." Trevor, bless his oblivious heart, never seemed to notice. Or if he did notice, he'd convinced himself it was normal family dynamics. "She's just being protective," he'd say, when I tried to talk to him about it. "She means well. You're probably reading too much into it." That phrase, reading too much into it, became the soundtrack of my marriage. Every time I tried to explain how his mother made me feel, that's what I heard. I started to wonder if I was losing my mind. Maybe I was being oversensitive. Maybe this was just how families worked and I didn't understand because my own family was so different. My parents, Linda and David Pearson, lived about 2 hours away in a small town called Millfield. They were both teachers. Mom taught elementary school. Dad taught high school history. They lived in a modest 2-story house with a vegetable garden in the backyard and furniture that had been chosen for comfort rather than impressing visitors. When you went to dinner at my parents' house, Mom might serve spaghetti on paper plates, while Dad told stories about his students and their cat, Muffin, tried to steal food off your plate. It was warm, chaotic, real. Nobody was performing for anyone else. Nobody was keeping score of who contributed what to the conversation or judging whether your shoes matched your purse. It was just family. But the Whitmores operated by different rules. Everything was a performance, a careful choreography where everyone had their role and was expected to play it perfectly. William was the successful, quiet patriarch. Diana was the elegant, devoted mother and community pillar. Trevor was the accomplished, dutiful son. And I was supposed to be the grateful, doting daughter-in-law who recognized how lucky I was to be included in their perfect family narrative. The problem was I wasn't particularly good at playing that role. I had opinions. I had a career that I cared about. I had friends and interests that existed independently of Trevor and his family. I didn't automatically defer to Diana's expertise on everything, from cooking to child rearing to interior decorating. And I think that's what really bothered her. I wasn't malleable enough to be shaped into her vision of the perfect daughter-in-law. Take my job, for example. I worked as a marketing manager for a tech startup that developed educational software. I loved my work. It was challenging, creative, and felt meaningful. We were helping teachers create more engaging learning experiences for their students. I was good at it too. I'd been promoted twice in the 3 years I'd been there, and my team consistently exceeded our targets. But Diana had this way of talking about my job like it was a cute little hobby I'd eventually outgrow. "Still playing with computers, I see," she'd say with a patronizing smile. "Well, I suppose someone has to do those kinds of jobs." Or she'd make comments about how demanding my schedule was. Poor Trevor, working so hard and then coming home to an empty house because Avery's still at the office. Never mind that Trevor's architecture firm required just as many long hours, or that he'd never once complained about my schedule. Then there was the house situation. Trevor and I had bought a small bungalow in a neighborhood called Riverside. It was a 1920s house with original hardwood floors, built-in bookshelves, and a kitchen with vintage tile that we absolutely loved. It needed some work, sure, but it had character. It felt like home. Diana hated it. She never said so directly, of course. Instead, she'd walk through our living room and say things like, "Oh, how cozy. You're certainly making the most of the space you have." Or she'd comment on how far it was from the good part of town, how the neighborhood was transitioning, how concerned she was about property values. She had this way of touring our house like she was a social worker conducting a home inspection. She'd run her finger along surfaces, checking for dust, peek into our refrigerator as if she was monitoring our grocery choices, and make suggestions for improvements that always seemed to involve spending money we didn't have on things that would make our house look more like hers.
The gift-giving was another battleground. Diana was very generous, with strings attached. She'd buy me expensive jewelry that wasn't my style at all, then act hurt when I didn't wear it to family events. She'd give me kitchen gadgets that were clearly meant to suggest I should be cooking more elaborate meals. She once gave me a subscription to a magazine called Better Homes and Gardens with a note that said, "I thought this might give you some inspiration for decorating ideas." Every gift came with an implied message: you're not quite right as you are, but here's something that might help you become more acceptable. The clothing comments were particularly brutal. Diana had this talent for complimenting me in a way that felt like criticism. "Oh, Avery, that dress is so interesting. You're always so bold with your fashion choices." Or, "That color is very striking on you. Not everyone could pull it off." The subtext was always there. You're trying too hard, or not trying hard enough, or trying in the wrong direction entirely. I started to dread getting dressed for these dinners. I'd stand in my closet for 20 minutes trying to predict how Diana would interpret whatever I chose to wear. Too casual, and she'd make comments about the importance of making an effort. Too dressy, and she'd suggest I was overdoing it or trying to show off. There was a narrow band of acceptability, and it seemed to shift based on her mood. The worst part was how she'd do it in front of other people. If Trevor's cousin Emma and her husband joined us for dinner, Diana would make sure to get her little digs in where Emma could hear them. "Avery works so much she barely has time to keep house. Isn't that right, dear?" Delivered with a laugh, as if we were all sharing a joke, but Emma would give me this sympathetic look that made me want to disappear into the floor. And Trevor, God love him, would just sit there, completely oblivious. Or maybe not oblivious, maybe willfully blind. Because calling out his mother's behavior would have meant acknowledging that the family dynamics he'd grown up with weren't as healthy as he'd believed. I tried talking to him about it countless times. I'd wait until we were driving home from dinner when the tension was still fresh and the examples were clear. "Did you hear what your mother said about my presentation at work? She called it cute." She was being supportive, Trevor would say, eyes on the road. "She doesn't understand tech stuff, but she was trying to show interest." "Trevor, she wasn't trying to show interest. She was being condescending." "You're reading too much into it, Avery. She means well." Always the same response, always the same dismissal. I started to feel like I was fighting shadows, trying to prove that something was wrong when everyone else seemed determined to pretend everything was fine. But here's the thing about constant, low-level emotional warfare: it wears you down. It makes you question your own perceptions. It makes you wonder if you're the problem, if you're too sensitive, too defensive, too ready to see malice where none exists. I started keeping a mental list of Diana's comments just to convince myself I wasn't imagining things. The way she'd forget my dietary restrictions and serve dishes with ingredients I couldn't eat, then act surprised when I didn't clean my plate. The way she'd bring up Trevor's ex-girlfriend, Rachel, who had apparently been such a sweet girl and so easy to talk to. The way she'd comment on how tired I looked whenever I'd had a particularly demanding week at work. None of it was overtly hostile. None of it was the kind of behavior you could point to and say, this is clearly unacceptable. It was death by 1,000 paper cuts, each one small enough to seem insignificant on its own, but together, they added up to a clear message. You don't belong here. The breaking point should have been the Thanksgiving incident 2 years into our marriage. Diana had invited Trevor's entire extended family, aunts, uncles, cousins, the works, about 20 people total. She had spent weeks planning the menu, organizing the seating arrangements, and making sure everything would be perfect. I'd offered to help multiple times, but she'd waved me off. Oh, don't worry about it, dear. I have everything under control. You just focus on whatever it is you need to focus on. So I'd brought a dessert, homemade apple pie using my grandmother's recipe. I was actually proud of it. The crust was perfectly golden, the filling was the right consistency, and it smelled amazing. Diana took one look at it and her face fell. Oh, I didn't realize you were bringing dessert. I already made 3 different pies, plus my famous bread pudding. I don't know where we'll put everything. The way she said it made it clear that my pie was the problem, the unwanted addition that was messing up her perfect plan. I felt like I was 12 years old again, showing up uninvited to a birthday party. I can take it back home, I offered, my cheeks burning with embarrassment. No, that would be silly, Diana said, but her tone suggested, yes, that would actually be the ideal solution. We'll find room for it somewhere. My pie ended up on a side table in the kitchen, never making it to the main dessert display. When dinner was over and people were choosing desserts, Diana made sure to highlight each of her creations while gesturing vaguely toward my pie as something Avery brought.
3 people tried it. 3. Trevor, of course, didn't see what the big deal was. She had already planned the desserts, honey. She was probably just trying to figure out the logistics. But I knew better. I knew this was another test I'd failed. Another example of how I didn't understand the unspoken rules of the Whitmore family dynamics. That night, lying in bed, I made a decision. I was going to start paying closer attention. I was going to document what was happening, not for revenge or drama, but for my own sanity. I needed proof that I wasn't imagining things, that the pattern of behavior I was experiencing was real and consistent. I started small. Just mental notes at first, then actual notes in my phone. Date, time, what was said, who was present. I told myself it was just for my own reference, a way to track patterns and maybe figure out how to better navigate these family situations. I had no idea that those notes would eventually become something much more important. I had no idea that in a few months, they would change everything. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you about that particular Sunday dinner. The one that started like all the others, but ended like nothing I could have ever imagined. The Sunday that changed everything. Trevor was driving that Sunday, which should have been my first clue something was off. He usually made me drive to his parents' house because, and I quote, "You handle my mother better when you're in control of when we leave." Charming, right? But that day, he seemed almost eager to get there. He'd even suggested we arrive 30 minutes early, which was completely unlike him. Trevor was usually the one dragging his feet, checking his phone one more time, finding excuses to delay our departure. He'd spend an extra 10 minutes in the bathroom, suddenly remember he needed to check his email, or decide this was the perfect moment to reorganize his wallet. Not today. Today, he'd been ready 15 minutes before we needed to leave, keys in hand, practically bouncing on his heels by the front door. "Just try to keep the peace tonight," he said as we pulled into the circular driveway on Elm Ridge Drive. His hands gripped the steering wheel a little too tightly, knuckles white against the leather. Mom's been stressed about the charity gala planning, and she mentioned wanting to discuss something important with us. Something important. In Diana's speak, that could mean anything from redecorating suggestions to a lecture about our life choices. But the way Trevor said it, with that careful, measured tone he used when he was trying not to reveal too much, made me suspect this was something bigger. What kind of something important? I asked, studying his profile as he parked behind his father's Mercedes. I don't know exactly. She was being vague. She just said she'd been thinking about our future, about what's best for the family. A chill ran down my spine. When Diana Whitmore started thinking about what was best for the family, it usually meant she'd identified something she wanted to change. And lately, I'd gotten the distinct impression that the thing she most wanted to change was me. The front door opened before we even knocked. Diana stood there in her signature cream-colored cardigan and perfectly pressed slacks, silver hair styled in that helmet-like do that probably required a team of professionals to maintain. But something was different about her expression. She looked excited, anticipatory, like someone who'd been planning a surprise party and couldn't barely contain her enthusiasm for the big reveal. "Trevor, darling." She wrapped my husband in a hug that lasted just long enough to make me feel invisible. Her manicured hands pressed against his back possessively, and I caught a whiff of her expensive perfume, something French and overwhelming that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget. And Avery. The temperature in her voice dropped about 20 degrees when she said my name, but there was something else there, too. A sharpness that felt more pointed than usual, like she was testing how my name felt in her mouth before she said something much worse. "Hi, Diana. Thank you for having us." I kept my voice warm, professional. 3 years of practice had taught me that matching her energy only made things worse. Kill them with kindness had become my survival strategy in this house. "Well, come in. Don't just stand there." She ushered us into the foyer with its gleaming marble floors and that ridiculous crystal chandelier that threw prismatic rainbows across the walls. Everything smelled like her signature vanilla candles and furniture polish, the scent of a house where appearance mattered more than comfort. "William's already in the dining room. We have a full table tonight." A full table? That was news to me. Usually these monthly dinners were just the four of us. Trevor, me, Diana, and William. Sometimes Trevor's cousin Emma would join us, but Diana always mentioned guests in advance. She was far too much of a control freak to spring surprise dinner guests without warning. She planned these dinners like military operations, complete with seating charts and conversation topics mapped out in advance. "Who else is coming?" I asked, trying to keep the anxiety out of my voice.
Diana's smile widened, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Oh, just a few family members, and some friends I thought you should meet." The way she emphasized "should" made it sound less like a social opportunity and more like a summons. As we walked toward the dining room, I could hear voices. Multiple voices engaged in animated conversation. My stomach tightened another notch. Surprise guests meant surprise audience members for whatever performance Diana had planned. And if there was one thing I'd learned about my mother-in-law over the past 3 years, it was that she never did anything without a purpose. The dining room was Diana's pride and joy, a formal space with dark wood paneling, oil paintings of stern-looking ancestors, and a table that could seat 12 when fully extended. Tonight, it was set for 8, which meant this was definitely not a casual family dinner. We entered to find not just William, who stood near the head of the table looking uncomfortable in his navy blazer, but also Trevor's Aunt Vivian and Uncle Bernard. Vivian was Diana's sister, equally polished but somehow warmer, while Bernard worked in real estate and had the kind of aggressive handshake that made you want to count your fingers afterward. Trevor's cousin Emma was there too, along with her husband Kyle. Emma had always been nice to me, one of the few family members who seemed to treat me like an actual person rather than an unwelcome addition to the family tree. She caught my eye as we entered and gave me a small, sympathetic smile that somehow made me more nervous rather than less. But the real surprise was the older couple I didn't recognize, a man and woman who looked like they'd stepped out of a country club catalog. He was wearing a perfectly tailored suit despite this being a Sunday dinner, and she had the kind of pearl necklace that probably had its own insurance policy.
Everyone, you remember Trevor and Avery, Diana announced, her voice carrying that artificial sweetness that always made my skin crawl. Trevor, Avery, I'd like you to meet James and Patricia Thornfield. James is the new president of the Ridgemont Community Foundation. Ah, so this was a networking dinner disguised as family time. Diana was always trying to impress important people, and apparently tonight we were all props in her performance. James Thornfield looked like the kind of man who made decisions about other people's lives from behind a mahogany desk, while Patricia had the bearing of someone who'd never had to worry about money a day in her life. "So nice to meet you both," I said, shaking their hands and wondering why Diana felt the need to introduce me to the Community Foundation. Unless James and Patricia have been such wonderful supporters of our local charities. I thought it would be nice for them to meet Trevor and his wife, show them what our younger generation is accomplishing. The table was set even more formally than usual. Extra china with the tiny blue flowers, additional silverware that created a small armory around each plate, cloth napkins folded into perfect triangles. Crystal water glasses caught the light from the chandelier above, creating tiny sparkles that felt almost mocking. As we took our seats, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Diana had placed me directly across from her in the hot seat where she'd have a clear view of every expression that crossed my face. William sat at the head of the table, looking like he'd rather be anywhere else. The Thornfields flanked Diana on either side, while Vivian and Bernard completed the circle. It felt less like a family dinner and more like a tribunal. Everyone, I hope everyone's hungry. I've prepared Trevor's favorite meal, of course, and I thought this would be the perfect opportunity for us all to have a little chat about the future. The way she said chat about the future made it sound like a threat. This wasn't going to be a normal dinner. This was going to be an execution. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.